Imagine the ultimate strategic paradox. On one side of the tarmac sits the F-35 Lightning II, America's $2 trillion stealth investment, built to be the invisible tip of the spear. On the other sits the S-400 Triumph, Russia's premier anti-aircraft system, engineered specifically to hunt that exact jet. This is not a battlefield error. It is not a captured enemy prize. It is a deliberate policy choice made by a critical NATO ally. By plugging Moscow's most advanced intelligence-gathering radar directly into the alliance's southern flank, Turkey backed Washington into an impossible corner. The Pentagon had to draw a hard line. Allowing Russian technicians to map stealth flight profiles would permanently compromise Western air dominance. What followed was a high-stakes geopolitical standoff that broke the rules of global defense, turning a single missile deal into a weapon that fractured NATO from the inside out. To understand why the United States couldn't simply walk away from Ankara, you have to look at a map. Turkey isn't just a problematic partner acting out of turn. It is the immovable eastern anchor of the NATO alliance. More importantly, it holds the physical keys to one of the most contested maritime choke points on Earth, the Bosphorus Strait. Under the 1936 Montreux Convention, Turkey possesses the absolute authority to control the flow of naval vessels between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. In a strategic landscape where Russian naval projection is a constant, pressing threat, that geographic leverage makes Turkey functionally indispensable to the defense architecture of Europe. Washington understood a grim geopolitical reality. Pushing President Erdogan completely out of the Western orbit risked handing the gates of the Black Sea directly to Vladimir Putin. If you want to understand the hidden machinery of global defense and the quiet wars fought over intelligence, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss our strategic deep dives. This geographical shield gave Turkey the confidence to push boundaries that other allies would never dare test. Ankara calculated that its prime real estate was far too valuable for Washington to ever truly discard. But that bold calculus was about to violently collide with the Pentagon's absolute red line regarding its $2 trillion crown jewel of aviation. To comprehend how a critical ally reached the point of risking its own air force for a Russian surface-to-air missile system, we first have to examine a fundamental breakdown in trust. The S-400 deal was not a sudden, erratic impulse. It was the culmination of a slow, deliberate fracture. The origin of the S-400 crisis does not begin in Moscow. It begins in Washington, during a grueling and ultimately doomed series of negotiations over the Patriot missile defense system. For years, Turkey sought to upgrade its aging air defense architecture to counter regional ballistic threats. Ankara wanted the American Patriot system, a proven capability heavily integrated across NATO. But President Erdogan's government had a firm condition. They didn't just want to buy the missiles off the shelf. They demanded significant technology transfer and co-production rights. Turkey's long-term defense doctrine hinged on achieving industrial autonomy to secure its position as a regional power. Washington, fiercely protective of its proprietary aerospace engineering, flatly refused. The United States was willing to sell the shield, but it would never hand over the blueprints. This impasse dragged on, creating a dangerous vacuum in Turkey's air defense coverage. As regional instability flared along its southern border with Syria, Ankara felt increasingly exposed. Temporary NATO Patriot deployments provided a stopgap, but they were entirely controlled by foreign commanders and subject to sudden withdrawal based on shifting political winds in Western capitals. When the US and Germany pulled their Patriot batteries out of southern Turkey in 2015 despite Ankara's protests, it validated the Turkish government's worst fears about Western unreliability. From the perspective of the Ministry of National Defense, relying exclusively on foreign-controlled systems was an unacceptable strategic vulnerability. They needed a sovereign capability, one they could command without asking permission from Brussels. Then came the geopolitical earthquake of July 2016. A faction within the Turkish military launched a violent coup attempt, seizing control of fighter jets and bombing the parliament building in Ankara. During the chaos, rogue F-16s, American-made aircraft, were used to target the president's plane. Furthermore, the slow and cautious initial response from Washington and European capitals to condemn the coup attempt deeply alienated the Turkish administration. Erdogan survived, but the psychological shockwave fundamentally altered his threat perception. He emerged from the crisis deeply suspicious of the West, harboring a profound distrust of his own NATO-integrated military apparatus. Sensing a historic opportunity to drive a wedge into the alliance, Vladimir Putin moved with calculated speed. Russia offered the S-400 Triumph, arguably one of the most capable surface-to-air missile systems in the world, with none of the political lecturing that accompanied American arms sales. Crucially, Moscow hinted at the possibility of future technology sharing, favorable financing, and rapid delivery timelines. They recognized that Turkey was actively looking for a way to decouple its immediate survival from American approval. For Ankara, the S-400 represented more than just a radar and a launch tube. It offered immediate security and an assertion of geopolitical independence. By 2017, the contract was signed, and Turkey had crossed the Rubicon. Erdogan framed the purchase as a sovereign right, an internal defense matter that should not concern the wider alliance. The political decision was locked in, driven by regime survival and national pride. But in the corridors of the Pentagon, the narrative wasn't about politics or bruised egos. It was about hard data. The physical presence of the S-400 inside NATO borders presented a catastrophic technical risk that the United States military simply could not tolerate. To understand why the Pentagon reacted with such absolute finality, you have to look past the missile tubes and examine the invisible architecture of the radar. The S-400 Triumph is heavily publicized for its kinetic reach, boasting the ability to swat down targets hundreds of miles away. But the interceptors are merely the kinetic punch. The true danger lies in the system's eyes and ears. The S-400 is anchored by a complex suite of early warning, acquisition, and engagement radars. Together, they function as a massive, multi-band electronic intelligence vacuum. When an S-400 sweeps the airspace, it isn't simply looking for a blip to target. It is harvesting vast quantities of telemetry. It measures radar cross-sections across multiple frequencies, tracks approach vectors, and maps electronic emissions. Over time, it builds highly detailed digital profiles, or signatures, of everything that flies within its formidable operational radius. For this network to function effectively within a national defense grid, it must be deeply integrated with the host country's Identify Friend or Foe, or IFF, systems. This is where the technical conflict evolves into a catastrophic security breach. IFF is the encrypted, digital language that military aircraft use to continuously broadcast their friendly status to ground radars, preventing fratricide. By plugging the S-400 into its national defense network, Turkey was essentially feeding the cryptographic pulse of NATO air operations directly into a Russian-built processing core. You cannot reliably firewall that level of integration. The system must inherently see and categorize friendly aircraft to operate. The hardware itself was a strategic nightmare, but the human element elevated the situation to a full-blown crisis. An S-400 battery is not a piece of plug-and-play technology. It requires years of specialized training, calibration, and constant software maintenance. The procurement contract explicitly stipulated that Russian military technicians and defense contractors would deploy to Turkish soil to establish the batteries, tune the sensors, and train local operators. Moscow was securing a persistent physical foothold deep inside NATO territory. These Russian technicians would have unfettered access to the system's raw data logs and diagnostic readouts. Every time a Turkish F-16 launched for a routine patrol, every time a NATO AWACS surveillance plane flew an established route over the Black Sea, the S-400 would passively record the interaction. Russia was not just selling a weapon, they were installing a sanctioned listening post on the southern flank of the Western Alliance. It was a textbook Trojan horse, a masterpiece of asymmetric intelligence gathering disguised as a lucrative commercial export. But while vacuuming up standard NATO flight telemetry was a massive intelligence victory for the Kremlin, it wasn't the ultimate prize. The Russian defense establishment was hunting a far more elusive and valuable target. They desperately needed to crack the code of modern American air dominance, and the Turkish deployment offered them the perfect laboratory to stare directly at the Pentagon's most expensive secret. The true target of this intelligence harvesting wasn't the legacy F-16, it was the F-35 Lightning II. To grasp the severity of the crisis, you have to understand that the F-35 is not just a fighter jet. It is a flying supercomputer, an information dominance platform designed to penetrate the most heavily defended airspace on the planet. Its survival relies on a capability that the Pentagon guards more fiercely than almost any other military secret: its stealth profile. But stealth is not a magic cloak of invisibility. It is a complex manipulation of physics, geometry, and data. The F-35 evades detection by managing its radar cross-section and relying on a massive, highly classified onboard database known as the Threat Library. The jet constantly listens for enemy radar emissions, identifies the specific system tracking it, and calculates the precise angle and altitude required to deflect those waves away from the receiver. It is a deadly game of electronic hide-and-seek. The Turkish S-400 deployment threatened to permanently break that game. Turkey was a Level 3 partner in the Joint Strike Fighter program, heavily invested in buying over 100 F-35s. If those stealth fighters operated from Turkish airbases protected by the S-400, they would be painted by Russian radar beams on a daily basis. The jets would be tracked during takeoffs, landings, and routine training patrols. This was the stealth paradox. The S-400 would observe the F-35 in its most vulnerable configurations. When a stealth jet lowers its landing gear, opens its weapons bays, or attaches external fuel tanks, its radar cross-section blooms dramatically. The Russian radar network, maintained and analyzed by technicians with direct ties to Moscow, would silently record thousands of hours of this high-resolution telemetry. Over time, the S-400's processing algorithms would learn. They would build a high-fidelity digital fingerprint of the aircraft, identifying microscopic acoustic and electronic vulnerabilities across multiple frequency bands. The system would learn exactly what the Lightning II looks like before its stealth geometry is fully optimized, stripping away the jet's element of surprise. For Washington, the realization was chilling. If they allowed the delivery of the F-35s to proceed, they would be actively facilitating the exact scenario the aircraft was built to defeat. The United States and its allies would essentially be subsidizing the research and development of Russian air defenses, training Moscow's algorithms on how to hunt and kill American pilots. The technical risk had breached the ultimate red line. The Pentagon had to execute a move that would send shockwaves through the global defense industry. When the ultimatum finally expired in July 2019, the United States executed a maneuver previously thought impossible. Washington officially expelled Turkey from the Joint Strike Fighter program. This was not a temporary suspension or a diplomatic warning. It was a complete and systematic eviction of a Level 3 development partner. The Pentagon ultimately concluded that excising a critical ally from a deeply integrated global supply chain was vastly preferable to risking its absolute advantage in stealth technology. The execution of that decision was swift and deeply disruptive. Turkish fighter pilots and maintenance crews, who had spent years training alongside American instructors at Luke Air Force Base in Arizona, were abruptly grounded. Their security clearances were revoked, and they were sent home. Simultaneously, the Department of Defense began the agonizing, expensive process of ripping Turkish aerospace contractors out of the manufacturing network. Turkish factories had been responsible for producing roughly 900 individual components for the F-35, ranging from fuselage sections to complex cockpit displays. Billions of dollars in projected industrial revenue evaporated overnight, forcing a chaotic reshuffling of the global production line to prevent delivery delays for other allied nations. The financial bleeding escalated dramatically the following year. In December 2020, the United States crossed an unprecedented diplomatic threshold by invoking CAATSA, the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, a legislative weapon originally designed to cripple the Russian, North Korean, and Iranian defense sectors, was deliberately turned against a NATO capital. The sanctions targeted Turkey's presidency of defense industries, freezing institutional assets, banning U.S. export licenses, and blocking access to international financial mechanisms. For a Turkish defense sector heavily reliant on Western microchips, engine components, and advanced sensors, it was a crippling blow to their sovereign development projects. This immediate fallout left the Turkish Air Force staring into a severe tactical void. Ankara had anchored its entire 21st century air superiority doctrine on acquiring over 100 Lightning IIs. Stripped of that fifth-generation future, the military was suddenly stranded. They were forced to rely entirely on an aging, heavily tasked fleet of F-16s, many of which were rapidly approaching the hard limits of their structural flight hours. The regional balance of power shifted in real time. As neighboring Greece began securing deals for its own F-35s and advanced French Rafale fighters, gaining a sudden qualitative edge over the heavily contested Aegean Sea, Turkey found itself fighting bitter political battles in Congress just to secure basic modernization kits for its legacy jets. Yet, the American response, while devastating to the defense sector, remained highly calibrated. Washington squeezed the military-industrial complex, but deliberately avoided deploying maximum macroeconomic warfare against the broader Turkish financial system. The sanctions operated as a scalpel rather than a sledgehammer. Policymakers in the State Department understood the absolute limits of punishment. Crushing the Turkish economy entirely would cross a point of no return. Geographic realities forced American strategists to keep a tenuous lifeline intact, acutely aware that pushing Ankara into total isolation would only guarantee a permanent, unbreakable partnership between Erdogan and the Kremlin. To understand why the United States stopped short of total economic warfare, you have to pull back from the tactical details of stealth fighters and look at the macro geography of the region. Why did Washington tolerate a NATO ally openly flouting its defense architecture? The answer lies in the dark waters of the Black Sea and the narrow shipping lane that connects it to the rest of the world. Turkey possesses the ultimate geopolitical trump card, the Montreux Convention of 1936. This international treaty grants Ankara absolute, legally binding control over the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits. Every warship that enters or exits the Black Sea does so strictly on Turkish terms. In the grand chessboard of great power competition, this makes Turkey the sole gatekeeper to Russia's southern maritime flank. For centuries, the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and now the modern Russian Federation have obsessed over warm water access. Their Black Sea fleet, headquartered in Crimea, is the anchor of their power projection into the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and North Africa. Without the ability to transit the Turkish Straits, the Russian Navy is effectively trapped in a geographic bathtub. Turkey is the only physical and legal barrier standing between Vladimir Putin and uncontested naval access to NATO's southern borders. This leverage became undeniably apparent when the war in Ukraine violently escalated. As Russian forces pushed across the border, President Erdogan invoked his authority under the Montreux Convention, effectively slamming the maritime gates shut. He denied Russian naval reinforcements the ability to transit into the Black Sea, directly impacting Moscow's maritime fire support and amphibious capabilities against Ukrainian coastal cities. This single administrative action demonstrated why the Pentagon could never afford to completely break ties. If Washington had pushed Ankara into a corner with maximum pressure sanctions, seeking to destroy the Turkish economy over the S-400 deal, the consequences would have been catastrophic for the alliance. A fully alienated Erdogan could have pivoted entirely toward Moscow, opening the straits and transforming the Black Sea into an uncontested Russian lake. The collapse of NATO's southeastern flank would be a strategic disaster, far outweighing the intelligence risk posed by one radar system. Turkey understood this math perfectly. The S-400 purchase was a calculated gamble, a high-stakes game of geopolitical chicken. Erdogan essentially bet that his control over the Bosphorus was more valuable to the West than the integrity of the F-35 supply chain. He was right. The United States absorbed the blow, secured its stealth technology by excising Turkey from the fighter program, but swallowed the bitter pill of maintaining the broader alliance. Trapped between American sanctions and Russian ambitions, Turkey had carved out a brutal, transactional space for itself. But cut off from the fifth-generation fighters they desperately needed, the Turkish military had to find a new way to project power and survive the modern battlefield. Necessity is the ultimate catalyst for military innovation. When the United States abruptly locked Turkey out of the Joint Strike Fighter program, the Turkish Ministry of National Defense was forced to confront a massive existential capability gap. They had anchored their future force structure on the acquisition of over 100 stealth fighters. Stripped of that manned fifth-generation capability and facing an increasingly volatile region, Ankara had to fundamentally rewrite its air power doctrine. The solution was not to seek an inferior manned replacement from Russia or China, but to aggressively accelerate a pivot toward asymmetric warfare. They doubled down on unmanned aerial systems. This pivot catalyzed a domestic industrial revolution, spearheaded by defense contractors like Baykar. The crown jewel of this effort was the Bayraktar TB2. On paper, it was a slow, prop-driven drone carrying a light payload, but in practice, it fundamentally altered the modern battlefield. The TB2 provided persistent intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and precision strike capabilities at a fraction of the cost of a traditional fighter jet. More importantly, it offered a platform that military commanders were actually willing to risk. In highly contested airspaces over Syria, Libya, and Nagorno-Karabakh, Turkish drones systematically dismantled traditional mechanized formations and Russian-built air defense systems. Turkey realized that instead of relying on a small, hyper-expensive fleet of stealth jets that they could not afford to lose, they could saturate the battle space with attritable, unmanned assets. This shift in doctrine transformed a tactical necessity into a strategic advantage. The success of these platforms turned Turkey from a net importer of advanced military hardware into one of the most highly sought-after arms exporters on the globe. Nations looking to replicate Ankara's battlefield successes began lining up to purchase Turkish drones, inadvertently tying their own national security architectures to Turkish supply chains. The evolution did not stop with propeller-driven platforms. Driven by the sting of the F-35 expulsion, the Turkish defense sector aggressively pushed into the next frontier: unmanned combat aerial vehicles. The development of the jet-powered Kızılelma, a drone designed with stealth characteristics, supersonic ambition, and the ability to maneuver like a traditional fighter, demonstrates a clear trajectory. Turkey is attempting to engineer its own unmanned, low-observable fleet to eventually fill the exact role the Lightning II was meant to play. The F-35 embargo, designed to punish and isolate the Turkish defense sector, inadvertently accelerated its independence. By forcing Ankara to survive outside the American aerospace umbrella, Washington catalyzed the creation of a drone superpower. This newfound industrial autonomy provided President Erdogan with a powerful new diplomatic currency. He no longer had to leverage Western platforms to project power. He was now the one selling the tools of modern warfare. The S-400 crisis and the resulting drone revolution did not just alter Turkey's military inventory, they crystallized an entirely new grand strategy. For decades during the Cold War, Ankara functioned as a reliable, largely compliant buffer state, anchoring the southeastern edge of the free world. That era is definitively over. Today, the Turkish Republic has aggressively positioned itself as an independent pole of power. They categorically refuse to be chained to the absolute diplomatic demands of either Washington or Moscow. This modern approach is recognized in geopolitical circles as transactional multi-alignment. It is a doctrine built on intentional strategic ambiguity and ruthless pragmatism. Instead of relying on rigid ideological loyalty, the Turkish government evaluates every geopolitical relationship strictly on a case-by-case, cost-benefit basis. They are perfectly willing to tightly compartmentalize their alliances. Ankara can easily engage in fierce proxy conflicts against Russian mercenaries in Syria and Libya on one day, and sign massive energy infrastructure deals with Vladimir Putin the next. The ongoing war in Ukraine provides the ultimate high-stakes showcase of this diplomatic balancing act. On one hand, Ankara serves as a critical military lifeline for Kyiv. They supply heavily armed drones, armored vehicles, and artillery that have actively targeted and destroyed Russian mechanized columns. On the other hand, President Erdogan outright refuses to join the comprehensive Western economic sanctions regime. He keeps his airspace open to Russian commercial flights, absorbs capital from sanctioned oligarchs, and relies heavily on discounted Russian energy imports to stabilize a highly volatile domestic economy. This extreme hedging forces the NATO alliance to navigate a constant state of internal friction. The contradiction is glaring when you look at the physical deployment of military hardware. Turkey currently hosts the Kurachik Early Warning Radar, a facility that feeds vital telemetry directly into the American ballistic missile defense shield, protecting the European continent. Yet, simultaneously, Turkish operators continue to maintain and power up the Russian-built S-400 air defense system just a few hundred miles away. For Washington, this represents a bitter, structural reality to accept. American policymakers can no longer simply dictate security terms to Ankara. They are forced to constantly negotiate them. By surviving the F-35 expulsion, developing a sovereign defense sector, and weaponizing its geographic monopoly over the Bosphorus, Turkey proved a dangerous point. They demonstrated that a determined middle power can successfully defy the core directives of a superpower and emerge intact. Other rising regional powers, from New Delhi to Riyadh, are watching this Turkish blueprint closely. They see a viable template for extracting concessions from multiple superpowers without fully committing to any single camp. However, whether this extreme hedging strategy is actually sustainable in the long term remains deeply uncertain. Juggling the vital security interests of an increasingly aggressive Russia and a highly polarized United States demands flawless execution. A single miscalculation over the Black Sea, or a sudden withdrawal of tolerance from either side, could instantly shatter the fragile equilibrium Erdogan has built. The S-400 deal will be remembered as one of the most effective, asymmetric disruptions in modern geopolitical history. Vladimir Putin didn't need to fire a single missile or order a single battalion across a border to fracture the defensive architecture of his primary adversary. By simply delivering a radar system to a willing buyer, Moscow forced the United States to severely penalize its own eastern anchor, effectively detonating a diplomatic bomb deep inside NATO territory. Yet, the alliance did not permanently shatter. It simply mutated. What emerged from the wreckage of the Joint Strike Fighter partnership is a stark new reality for Western defense planners. The era of absolute, unquestioning loyalty within the alliance is definitively over. It has been replaced by a highly conditional, transactional landscape where vital partners are fully willing to play both sides of the geopolitical divide to secure their own sovereign interests. Turkey proved that strategic geography can serve as an impenetrable shield against total diplomatic excommunication. How do you think Washington should handle critical allies that leverage their geographic monopoly to play both sides of a conflict? Let us know your assessment in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more deep-dive defense analysis. As the world fractures into competing military blocs, the crisis over the Bosphorus offers a chillingly clear warning. The defining conflicts of the next decade won't necessarily begin with armored columns crossing a contested border or kinetic strikes against naval vessels. They will begin with the quiet, structural theft of data. The future of warfare will be fought over the invisible architecture of electronic intelligence, the integrity of defense supply chains, and the shifting, unpredictable nature of global alignment. In the 21st century, the most dangerous weapons are no longer just the ones that destroy cities. They are the ones that force a nation to choose between protecting its most guarded secrets and abandoning its most vital allies.